The dust was a living thing in that town, a fine red powder that clung to everything, tasting of iron and thirst. It coated the woman's bare feet, filled the folds of her ragged dress, and settled in the hollows of her daughter's sleeping face. They were tied to the hitching post in the center of the square, the coarse rope a brand against the woman's wrists. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth, on the bowed heads of the weary. Her daughter, small and thin as a fence rail, coughed a dry, rattling sound that tore at the woman's insides. The child's fevered cheek rested against her mother's hip, a burning weight of love and fear. The woman did not look at the faces that passed. The faces were a blur of judgment and indifference. She had learned long ago that meeting their eyes only invited a cruelty she could no longer bear. So she watched the dust devils dance at the edge of town, and she waited. The crowd was a low murmur, a beast with many mouths. A few men laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. A woman in a clean calico dress pulled her own child closer, her lips a thin line of disapproval. Most just stared for a moment, their curiosity sated, then moved on, leaving the woman and her child to bake in the relentless quiet between gazes. They were a spectacle, a piece of human driftwood washed up on the shores of this merciless place. From the shadowed doorway of the general store, a man watched. His name was Elias, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. The dust of his own solitude was ground into the lines of his face, into the worn leather of his boots. He had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his cupboards echoed the emptiness of his house. He had not come for this. He saw the way the woman stood, straight-backed against the post, a single defiant reed in a harsh wind. He saw the child's small chest shudder with each breath. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced the careful numbness he had built around his heart. Another small frame, another fever. He shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under his boots. He was a man who minded his own, who had learned the hard lesson that meddling only brought more pain. Then Silas came striding through the dust, his spurs jingling with a sound of arrogant ownership. He was a man whose smiles never reached his eyes, a man who saw the world in terms of what he could take. He stopped before the woman, looking her over like livestock. "Still here, are you?" Silas's voice was slick with false charm. He gestured to the child. "The little one's no good to anyone like this. A burden." The woman did not answer. She pressed her lips together, a line of white in her grimy face, and pulled her daughter impossibly closer. Silas sighed, a theatrical sound for the onlookers who had begun to gather again, drawn by the prospect of a transaction. "I'll be fair. A strong back is worth something. But the girl," he shook his head, "she's dead weight." Elias felt something shift inside him, a rusty gear grinding into motion. It was not pity, not exactly. It was a kind of weary recognition. He had seen this brand of casual cruelty before, seen it rot things from the inside out. He pushed himself away from the doorframe, his shadow stretching long and thin across the sun-scorched ground. He walked toward the post, his steps slow and deliberate. The crowd parted for him, murmuring. They knew Elias, knew the tragedy that had hollowed him out years ago, leaving him a ghost on his own land. His presence was an unexpected variable. Silas turned, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Elias, come to do some shopping?" Elias didn't look at Silas. His gaze was on the child. He saw the cracked lips, the faint blue tinge around them. He knew that look. He had seen it in the small mirror above his own washbasin, reflected in his own son's face, moments before the silence came. "The girl," Elias said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that had not been used for much more than talking to horses. Silas raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" "I'll take her," Elias said. The words came out of him before he had fully formed them. A dam breaking. A ripple went through the small crowd. Silas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You? What in God's name for? She's half dead." "I have a place," Elias said, his eyes still on the child. She can be sick there as well as here. The woman finally looked up. For the first time, her eyes met his. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a terror so profound it was almost calm. He saw a flicker of something else in their depths, a desperate, calculating fire. "No," she said. Her voice was thin, but it did not waver. "You don't understand." She turned her gaze, burning with a sudden, fierce intensity, on Elias. "He won't let her go alone. He thinks I am worth something." The words were acid on her tongue. Then she did something that stunned the silent onlookers. She straightened her spine as much as the ropes would allow and spoke directly to Elias. A plea that was also a demand, a surrender that was also a strategy for survival. "If you take my daughter, you must take me too." It was not a question. It was the statement of an unbreakable bond. Silas laughed again, louder this time. "Hear that, Elias? Package deal. The broken mare and her sickly foal. What'll you pay for such a fine pair?" Elias ignored him. He looked at the woman. He saw the raw, scraped flesh of her wrists, the fierce, protective curve of her arm around her child. He saw a will to live that shamed his own long apathy. He thought of his quiet house, the empty rooms, the dust motes dancing in sunbeams that lit nothing of importance. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around the small, heavy pouch of coins he had brought for supplies. He pulled it out. It was not much. It was everything he had. He tossed it to Silas. It landed in the dust with a soft, final thud. "That settles my debt with you," Elias said to Silas, his voice flat. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would be understood in this town. A man's honor, a settled score. It was a language Silas respected more than mercy. Silas stared at the pouch, then at Elias's hard, unreadable face. He bent, snatched up the coins, and weighed them in his hand. A smirk played on his lips. "Your funeral, old man." He turned and walked away without a backward glance, the jingle of his spurs receding. The crowd began to disperse, the show over. They left Elias and the woman alone in the vast, indifferent sunlight. He moved closer. She flinched, pulling her daughter tighter, a low, guttural sound of warning in her throat. He stopped, holding up his hands to show they were empty. He drew a small, worn pocket knife from his belt. The blade clicked open. He did not approach her front. He walked around the post carefully, giving her space. He reached for the ropes that bound her, his movements slow and predictable. His knuckles brushed the rough wood of the post. The hemp was thick and stiff. He sawed at it, the blade moving back and forth. The fibers parted with a rasping sound. The tension gave way. Her hands fell to her sides, limp and raw. She did not move. She stood there, untethered but still bound by shock and fear. Elias folded the knife and put it away. He looked at the child, whose breathing was shallow. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy duster, the one that smelled of dust and horse and loneliness. He draped it carefully over the small, shivering form. He turned and started walking toward his wagon at the edge of the square. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. A mother always follows her child. The journey to his ranch was carved out of silence. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted track, and the wind whispered through the dry grass, a lonely sound that matched the landscape of his heart. The woman sat in the back of the wagon, cradling her daughter, who was wrapped in his coat. She had not spoken a word since he cut her free. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, on the place where the pale, washed-out sky met the jagged line of the mesas. He could feel her gaze on his back, watchful and uncertain. It was a weight he was not used to. The silence in his wagon was different from the silence in his house. His silence was old and settled, like dust on furniture. This new silence was alive, taut with unspoken questions and fear. Halfway there, the sun at its zenith, he stopped the horses. He got down and walked to the back of the wagon. The child's eyes were open, glassy with fever. He uncorked his canteen and held it out. The woman stared at it, then at him. Her expression was unreadable. He saw the deep distrust etched around her eyes. He set the canteen down on the wagon bed, a foot away from her, and walked back to the horses, giving her the dignity of choosing. He heard the faint scrape of metal on wood, the soft sound of swallowing. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. The ranch was not much to look at. A small, sturdy house built of weathered pine, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, and a web of fences that stretched out until they disappeared into the vast emptiness. The land itself was stark and beautiful, unforgiving and honest. A single grave marker stood on a low hill overlooking the house. A simple wooden cross. He tried not to look at it, but he felt its presence like a constant, low ache. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He got down and went to the back. "We're here," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. The woman looked at the house, at the endless, lonely land surrounding it. Her face was a mask of exhaustion. She tried to stand, her limbs stiff, the child a heavy weight in her arms. Elias hesitated for only a second. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet. He reached for the child. The woman flinched and clutched her daughter tighter, a feral protectiveness in her eyes. "I won't hurt her," he said, his voice steady. He kept his hands out, open and still. He waited. He had learned patience from horses and from grief. He could wait. After a long moment that stretched thin between them, she relented. Her arms trembled as she carefully transferred the sleeping, feverish child into his hold. The girl was lighter than he expected, a bundle of bones and heat. The feeling of her small body in his arms was a ghost haunting him, a memory of a weight he thought he would never feel again. He turned abruptly and carried her inside. The house was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old sorrow. He took the child to the room at the back, the one that had been his wife's, the one he had not entered in 5 years, except to open a window and let the wind clear the air. The bed was still made, a faded quilt folded neatly at its foot. He laid the child down gently on the mattress, pulling the quilt over her. When he turned, the woman was standing in the doorway, a shadow framed by the fading light. She looked at the room, at the simple wooden dresser, at the single dried flower still in a vase on the nightstand. She understood. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, he saw not fear, but a shared, silent acknowledgement of loss. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing the doorframe. "The well is out back. There's food in the pantry. What's left of it," he gestured to the main room. "You can sleep in here, by the fire." He meant to give her space to establish a boundary. But she looked at the open room, then back toward the closed door where her daughter lay sleeping. He saw a new kind of panic in her eyes, the fear of separation. He understood that too. "Or in there," he said, nodding toward the bedroom. "There's a chair," he paused, then added, "I don't lock doors." He turned and went outside, leaving her to the quiet of the house. He unhitched the horses, his movements automatic. The sky was now a deep, star-dusted velvet. The land was holding its breath, vast and silent. He had brought 2 strangers into his fortress of solitude. He did not know if he was the kindest man she had ever met, or the most foolish. He suspected he might be both. The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by conversation but by the sun's slow arc across the sky. A life began to stitch itself together with the raw, unspoken thread of routine. Elias rose before dawn, the chill of the house a familiar companion. He would light the fire in the main room's hearth, his movements quiet so as not to disturb the 2 sleeping in the back. He would go out to the barn, the scent of hay and animals a comfort. He mended fences that the wind had worn down, his hands working with the muscle memory of years. The woman, whose name he still did not know, tended to her daughter. For the first week, she barely left the room, emerging only to fetch water or food, her movements quick and silent as a mouse. Elias would leave a bowl of broth or a piece of bread on the small table by the door, and later he would find the bowl empty. Slowly, the child's fever broke. The rattling cough softened. Elias heard the first faint sound of her voice one afternoon, thin as a bird's call, and it startled him. He stopped his work, hammer in hand, and just listened. As the girl healed, the woman began to emerge from her cocoon. She started with the house. One morning, Elias came in from the cold to find the floor swept clean of its usual layer of dust and grime. The next day, the layer of soot on the mantelpiece was gone. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never speaking to him, her eyes always cast down. But she was slowly claiming a space for herself in the silence. She was making his house a home, and it unsettled him. He found ways to answer her silent work with his own. He noticed her shawl was thin and frayed. He went into the old chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out one of his wife's, a thick wool the color of cream. He left it folded on the chair by the fire. The next morning she was wearing it. She did not thank him, but she pulled it tighter around her shoulders when a gust of wind rattled the windows, and that was enough. One afternoon, he was whittling a piece of scrap pine on the porch. His knife moved, shaving off curls of wood, until a small, rough shape of a bird emerged in his palm. He smoothed its edges, thinking of nothing and everything. On an impulse, he left it on the windowsill of their room while they were outside. He never saw her pick it up, but later, he saw it clutched in the little girl's hand as she slept. The little girl, whose name he also did not know, began to venture out. She was shy with her mother's watchful eyes. She would sit on the porch steps, the wooden bird in her hand, and watch him work. She never came closer. One day, Elias was coming back from the far pasture when he saw the woman standing by the grave on the hill. The wind was teasing the edges of her shawl and whipping strands of her dark hair across her face. She stood there for a long time, her hands clasped in front of her. When she finally walked back down to the house, he saw she had left something behind. He waited until she and the child were inside before he walked up the hill himself. There, at the base of the wooden cross, was a small, tight bouquet of purple wildflowers. A simple offering, an act of grace in a world that had shown her none. He stood there as the wind turned mean, staring at the small splash of color against the weathered wood, and felt a crack appear in the ice around his heart. That night, the bread she had baked was hard. It was the first time she had used the old oven. He broke off a piece and chewed it slowly. It was nearly inedible. "It's a little dry," he said. The sound of his own voice in the quiet kitchen was jarring. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her in weeks. She froze, her hands still in the wash basin. She would not look at him. He expected fear or shame. "You didn't complain about mine," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That loaf died in vain." She turned from the basin then, and a small, hesitant smile flickered on her own face before vanishing. It was the first time he had seen it. It was like watching the sun break through clouds after a long winter. The nights grew colder. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a hungry wolf. One evening, a storm rolled in, black and violent. Thunder cracked overhead, and the little girl cried out in her sleep. Elias sat by the fire, mending a piece of leather harness. He heard the woman's soft, humming voice from the back room, a low, sweet lullaby. He stopped his work, his hands still. He closed his eyes and just listened to the sound. It was a sound of life, of care, of tenderness. It was a sound his house had not known for a very long time. Later, she came out to the main room. The fire was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She did not sit, but stood by the hearth, warming her hands. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. She was looking into the flames, not at him. He knew what she was asking. Why them? Why him? He thought for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. He could have told her about the grave on the hill, about the small body he had held, grown cold in his arms, about the silence that had followed. But those were his ghosts, not hers. "The ground is hard here," he said finally, his voice rough. "Nothing should have to be alone in it." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he saw in her eyes a depth of understanding that needed no more words. She gave a small, single nod. The unspoken thing had been acknowledged. A foundation of trust, fragile as a spider's web but they're all the same, was laid between them in the flickering firelight. She turned and went back to her daughter, leaving him with the warmth of the fire and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of a shared silence. The first sign of trouble was a plume of dust on the far horizon, a smudge against the clean blue sky. It was too deliberate for a dust devil, too thin for a storm. Elias saw it from the barn roof where he was patching a loose shingle. He stopped hammering, his body going still. He had lived in this empty space for so long he knew its rhythms, its moods. This was not a part of them. This was an intrusion. He watched the dust cloud grow, resolving itself into the shape of a lone rider. His hand tightened on the handle of his hammer. A knot of cold dread formed in his gut. He knew with a certainty that needed no proof who it was. The past had a long reach. He climbed down the ladder, his movements measured, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. The woman was by the well, drawing water, her daughter playing nearby, chasing a butterfly with shrieks of newfound laughter. The sound, which had started to become a part of the ranch's fabric, now felt fragile, breakable. The woman saw him looking toward the horizon, and her gaze followed his. She saw the rider. The laughter died in her daughter's throat. The woman's body went rigid. The bucket of water slipped from her hand, splashing across the dry ground, the dark patch of mud evaporating almost instantly in the heat. She snatched her daughter's hand and backed away toward the house, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. Elias walked to the porch and waited. He did not go inside for his rifle. This was not a fight to be started with guns. It was a fight of wills, to be won or lost right here, on the weathered planks of his home. The rider was Silas. Of course it was Silas. He rode up to the fence line and stopped, not dismounting, an act of casual dominance. He surveyed the small scene, the repaired fences, the clean-swept porch, the woman and child half hidden in the doorway behind Elias. A sneer curled his lip. "Well, well," Silas called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Playing house, are we, old man? I have to admit, you've cleaned her up nicely." He looked pointedly at the woman. "Almost looks like a decent piece of property now." Elias did not rise to the bait. He stood, solid and unmoving as a mountain. "You're not welcome here, Silas." "Oh, I think I am," Silas said, swinging a leg over his horse and dropping lightly to the ground. He hitched the reins to the fence post. "See, we had a deal. A debt settled, you said. But that was for my trouble. For the burden of that sickly brat." He jerked his chin toward the little girl, who whimpered and hid her face in her mother's dress. "I let you take the girl. But the woman, she's still mine. The agreement was for her labor. And I've come to collect." He started toward the porch, his spurs kicking up little puffs of dust. His argument was built on the twisted logic of ownership, a claim that stripped a person of their soul and turned them into a thing to be traded. Elias stepped forward, moving to the edge of the porch steps, physically placing himself between Silas and the door. He was shorter than Silas and older, but he stood on his own land, and that gave him a different kind of height. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice low and cold as a winter creek. "She's not yours." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that so? Who says? You? The law says a contract is a contract. I brought her to this territory. She owes me." He put his foot on the bottom step. "Now, are you going to step aside like a sensible man? Or do I have to move you?" The air crackled with tension. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between the two men. From behind Elias, there was a sound. Not a cry of fear, but the scrape of wood on wood. The woman stepped out from the doorway to stand beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were on fire. In her hands, she held the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She held it not like a weapon she was used to, but with a white-knuckled desperation that made it more dangerous. "I belong here," she said. Her voice was not thin or quiet anymore. It was clear and strong, forged in the quiet resilience she had been building for weeks. It rang across the yard. Silas stopped, his eyes widening in surprise. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected defiance. He looked from her to Elias, then back again. They stood together, a united front. The old, broken man and the discarded woman. They were no longer two separate, wounded souls. They were a fortress. "She said she belongs here," Elias repeated, his voice flat and final. "This is her home." Silas's sneer faltered. He was a bully, and the currency of bullies is fear. He saw none here. He saw only a hard, unyielding wall of conviction. He looked at the poker in the woman's hands, at the cold promise in Elias's eyes. His own bluster began to ring hollow, even to himself. He was one man, miles from any town, miles from anyone who would back his claim. He hesitated, then took a step back. He tried to reclaim his swagger, but it was gone. "You'll regret this, Elias. Both of you." The threat was empty, a final, pathetic grasping for power. He unhitched his horse, his movements jerky and angry. He swung himself into the saddle and glared at them one last time. "You can keep the damaged goods," he spat, and spurred his horse, galloping away the way he had come, leaving only a cloud of angry dust in his wake. They stood there on the porch, watching until he was just a speck on the horizon. The poker clattered from the woman's trembling hands onto the wooden planks. The little girl, who had been silent through it all, finally let out a sob and wrapped her arms around her mother's legs. The woman sank to her knees and held her daughter, burying her face in the child's hair. Her whole body shook with the aftermath of the confrontation. Elias turned and looked down at her. He saw not a victim but a survivor, a fighter. He reached down, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he placed it gently on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her with intention, with comfort. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "You didn't run." She shook her head, a small, fierce movement.
"No.
"I didn't run." They stayed like that for a long moment, the man's hand on the woman's shoulder, the child clinging to her mother, the vast, quiet land bearing witness. The threat had been repelled. The sanctuary had held. And in the silence that followed, something new and fragile and incredibly strong had been forged between them. The dust Silas had kicked up settled back onto the earth. The air was clean again. In the quiet that descended, the house seemed to breathe a long, slow sigh of relief. The confrontation had been a fire, and in its ashes, they were irrevocably changed. That evening they sat by the hearth. The fire danced, painting the room in warm, living light. The little girl slept soundly in the back room, the wooden bird on the pillow beside her head. The silence between them was different now. It was not a space of caution, but one of comfort, of shared victory. Elias looked at the woman. He had taken her in, sheltered her, defended her. But he realized, with a startling clarity, that he did not even know her name. He had given her refuge, but he had not given her the simple dignity of an identity beyond the woman. The standoff on the porch had not just been about fending off Silas. It had been her reclamation of self. "I never asked your name," he said into the quiet. She looked up from the flames, her gaze soft in the firelight. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "It's been a long time since anyone has." She took a breath. "It's Lena." Lena. The name was simple, beautiful, fit her. It gave her form and substance beyond her past. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. "Felt right. And your daughter." "Hope," she said, her voice catching slightly on the word. "Her name is Hope." Elias felt the names settle into the foundations of the house, filling the empty spaces. Lena and Hope. They were no longer nameless refugees. They were people. They were here. "This is your home now, Lena," he said, the words a promise, a declaration. "Yours and Hope's. No one will take you from it." Tears she had held back all day finally welled in her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of fear or sorrow, but of release. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. The next morning, Lena did something symbolic. She took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one that held the memory of the dust and the ropes and the humiliation, and she walked to the fire pit outside. Elias watched from the porch as she dropped it into the ashes of last night's cook fire. She struck a match and tossed it in. The dry fabric caught instantly, flaring up in a bright, hungry flame. They watched together as it burned, curling into black, weightless cinders that drifted up and were carried away by the wind. It was a funeral for the woman she had been forced to be. In the days that followed, a new life began. Elias found himself smiling, a strange and rusty feeling on his face. He spent an afternoon building a small, sturdy swing from a thick rope and a smooth plank of wood, hanging it from the lone, strong branch of the cottonwood tree behind the house. The sound of Hope's laughter as Lena pushed her became the new music of the ranch. He taught Lena how to mend the tougher leather harnesses, her small, quick hands surprisingly adept. She taught him that wildflowers on the table could make a simple meal feel like a feast. They worked side by side, stitching their lives together with the quiet threads of shared days. The house, once a hollow shell of memory, began to feel full. It breathed with them. One evening, they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the sun set, painting the mesas in hues of blood orange and deep violet. Hope was asleep in Lena's lap, her small face peaceful. Elias looked at them, at this small family he had stumbled into, this family that had saved him from his own ghost-haunted existence as much as he had saved them. He thought of the empty years, the crushing weight of solitude. He had thought that fire only changes everything if it burns it all to the ground. But he was wrong. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He reached over and, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, tucked a stray strand of hair behind Lena's ear. Her skin was warm. She leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second, a silent acceptance, a quiet promise of a shared future. The house stood behind them, its windows glowing with the light of the lamp she had lit. It was no longer just his house. It was their home, and under the vast, starlit sky, on that small patch of hard-won ground, they were enough. This story, it isn't just about a rescue on a dusty street. It's about the quiet courage it takes to build a home inside the walls of another person's heart. It's a story about naming things. A man who had forgotten his own purpose finds it by giving a woman back her name. A woman who had been made an object reclaims her soul by naming her new life. So here is your naming. That quiet, stubborn kindness you hold inside you, the part that makes you stop for the stray, that makes you stand up when it would be easier to walk away, that is your strength. That flicker of defiance in you, the part that says, "I am more than what has happened to me," that is your fire. We all have our own harsh frontiers to cross, our own ghosts to quiet. But if you're brave enough to offer a little warmth in the cold, if you're brave enough to accept it when it's offered, you might just find that you're not building a shelter for someone else. You're building a home for yourself. You might just find that the things you thought were broken can be pieced back together to make something more beautiful than before.